Now, any of you reading about narcissism and narcissistic abuse have heard people talking about attachment. And you may have read all kinds of stuff about attachment styles in adulthood, attachment styles in children. So, let's talk about attachment and specifically about how that relates to this developmental path of potentially making or raising a narcissistic person. Welcome back to this series on how to raise or how to make a narcissist. It's not my goal for this series, but if you could understand some of the pathways that lead to sort of the development of a narcissistic person, it might give you some sense of the why of narcissism and also sometimes can work from a sort of parenting perspective. Before I begin, though, thank you to all of you who subscribe to this channel. This community is always continuing to grow, and I'm really glad to see that people are really internalizing these lessons. If you're new to this channel, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and enjoy and join this wonderful community of survivors of narcissistic abuse or people who are simply curious about it. Now, in the 1950s, a psychiatrist named John Bowlby and a psychologist named Mary Ainsworth laid out a developmental model called attachment theory. This model focused on our earliest relationships, typically with parents or other early primary caregivers. They showed that a child needs a solid, secure, consistent relationship with just one solid, safe, secure, and available adult caregiver to set the foundation for normal development. That adult becomes a sort of base camp for the child. And if the child is at all stressed, where do they want to be? They want to be near their safe base. These researchers also focused on understanding how infants reacted to a separation, even a brief separation, from their primary caregiver, or to the moments when their caregiver wasn't readily available. Now, in their definition, a good caregiver is someone who is available, consistent, and responsive. And the child wants to know that the caregiver is close and connected. If a caregiver is not available or responsive, then the child will be anxious and will search their environment or will cry or do something else to call out for the caregiver. If the caregiver does not show up, then the baby will experience despair. Now, I would love to hear, though, drop a comment if you ever remember learning about attachment, maybe in a psychology class, maybe in other things that you've read. It'd be interesting to know how many of us already know about this idea of attachment theory. Now, it's normal for young children to become upset when their caregiver leaves. It's also normal for a child to be calmed down rather quickly by that caregiver when they return. There is lots of information out there on attachment theory if you want to learn more. For example, about something called the strange situation experiment, etc. It's really interesting stuff. You may have learned about it in school. But suffice it to say, a child, all children, need a consistent, safe person in their lives to develop a healthy sense of self and a healthy psychological development. Bowlby and Ainsworth and other researchers subsequent to them describe different attachment styles, including a secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. Since then, others have also added what's called the disorganized attachment style. Now, secure attachment is what we see when we see a child who is a little sad when their parent leaves, but then they're soothed by whomever the other caregivers might be. It might be a babysitter or a teacher. And then when the parent comes back to them, the child is quickly soothed by their parent's return. The anxious attachment style is when the child becomes extremely rattled and upset when the parent departs. And it's hard to soothe the child even when the parent comes back. In the anxious attachment style, the child will go back and forth between wanting to be comforted and then wanting to punish the parent for leaving. Now, for those of you dealing with narcissistic relationships in adulthood, does that sound familiar? The push-pull of them, wanting you to reassure them and then wanting to punish you? Definitely drop in a comment if you've seen that kind of anxious attachment style play out in adulthood. Now, finally, in the avoidant attachment pattern, children do not get too upset when the parent leaves. And when their parent returns, they actively avoid them. Now, researchers Cynthia Hazan and Philip Shaver have also talked about adult attachment styles. Securely attached adults are sad when they have to say goodbye to their loved ones or partners, especially to their partners. And then they're genuinely happy and elevated when they come back together with their partner. Avoidant adults, they don't really care that much about close relationships. And they don't want to be dependent or don't really care about other people. So they don't care about goodbye and they don't really care about hello. But when it comes to narcissistic relationships, it really appears to relate most closely to how Shaver and Hazan write about anxiously attached adults. Anxiously attached adults are always worried that other people do not love them and become frustrated when their needs are not met. People who are narcissistic most often look anxiously attached. They are always worried that whomever they proclaim to love will not return their love, and they get rageful when their needs are not met. So then comes that punitive part. In a way, the anxiously attached adult mirrors their punitive anger at their caregiver from childhood, right? They're still mad about that. They take it out in the adult relationship. The anxiously attached adult is often inconsistent, cold, rejecting, and unempathic with their partners, and they're upset when their needs don't get met. This anxious attachment style can also sort of result in sort of an obsessive style that is very much a signature of the narcissistic relationship. Narcissistic folks are caught in a constant push-pull in their relationships, and that's why we see the constant and dramatic arguments, breaking up and getting back together. Lots of anxiety, begging the partner to come back, the hoovering. It's that anxious attachment come to life in its adult form. And that's really what a lot of narcissistic relationships look like. In a lot of the theoretical research on adult narcissism, there is definitely the suggestion that many, if not most, narcissistic people have an anxious attachment style. Lots of volatility. They definitely don't do well with goodbyes. They also don't do well with hellos, especially if there's been a separation. In a way, the narcissistic adult is still the angry child that can't believe that you left home, even if it's just to go to work, right? And there's lots of punitive acting out in the relationship. That means that people who do therapy with narcissistic people try to address that anxious attachment by being consistently available at that session time, right? The consistent available parent. Now, narcissistic clients often try to take advantage of that. They will frequently try to touch base with or even bother the therapist in between sessions. They want to have access to them all the time. So the work becomes letting the client know, I am here for you every week at this time. This is your time. But I can't be there for you all the time throughout the week. Setting that boundary and setting the consistency basically alongside the healthy boundaries they never had. None of this really ever works with the narcissistic client, which is actually why narcissistic clients often burn therapists out. The therapist keeps setting boundaries, the client keeps claiming to have emergencies, or they keep sending messages or communications to the therapist keeps setting higher boundaries, and either the client gets frustrated that they cannot always use the therapist as a pacifier, and then they drop out of therapy, or the therapist burns out altogether and either drops the client or, in some cases, literally stops being a therapist. So a parent doesn't really have the same option, but you could see the effect that that child might have had on a parent as well. Now, where do anxious attachments come from? Now, lots of places. Unavailable caregivers in childhood, and this can be for such a wide range of reasons. Perhaps the caregivers are actually gone and there is no good substitute. It could be due to chaos in the household, parents who are preoccupied with stressors, parents who are egocentric, parents who are just immersed in their own lives and interests and are maybe perhaps narcissistic themselves and don't want to be bothered with children. The child, in these cases, where there's inconsistent parents, never gets that secure base to return to, never learns to feel safe and secure in the world, and may feel a constant sense of being left or abandoned, and then has difficulty regulating or soothing themselves. And this extends into adult relationships. And in adult relationships, there can be lots of anxiety about abandonment, a neediness or a clinginess, and rage at the partner because of this anxiety, and to punish them for not being available to them all the time. Now, here's an interesting paradox. When people recognize that anxious attachment is a big part of what may underlie adult narcissistic styles, becomes sort of an interesting setup for cognitive dissonance for the person who's in the relationship with the narcissistic person. Because then the rescuer hat goes on. And the belief is that if I am always there for them, and I am now the new consistent parent, and I'm available, and I'm loving, then I can fix their anxious attachment. Nope, not going to happen. You can't, and frankly, it's not your job. It's not your place or need as a partner to reparent your partner. Their work is to do the hard work of therapy and to work through this in therapy, as uncomfortable as it may be. You are not their abandoning, unavailable parent, and nothing you can say or do is going to change that. And as you can see, if you fall into this trauma-bonded, I am going to fix this attachment issue for you role, you, in essence, have, instead of being a partner, really become the parent of a tantruming, dysregulated child, again, instead of being an adult partner to another adult. Now, the attachment origin model of narcissism is one of the more robust and likely useful explanatory models. It explains why we see narcissistic personality across all groups, all over the world, and across even socioeconomic groups. For example, there may be different reasons why a wealthy parent is not available to a child compared to why a person of fewer economic resources may not be available to a child, but the child experiences it the same way, and it can have similar impacts. It also explains the challenges that we see that narcissistic people have with both intimacy and empathy. It explains all of the challenges with dysregulation and the incapacity to engage in something called self-soothing. It explains the abandonment fears and the anger that narcissistic people often display, not just when you say goodbye, but even when you reconnect. It explains the vindictiveness and the punitiveness of these relationships. So it's a theory that really does kind of reach into all the kinds of corners of narcissism, and it makes sense of a lot of it. So let's say you're a parent still raising a child and you don't want to raise a narcissistic child. What do? Try to be consistent, available, responsive, and present. Be that secure base for your child. The younger and the more consistently this happens, the better. As I said, you are base camp and the safe place that lets the child get more bold and courageous with regard to exploring their world. Number 2, you got to put down the devices and just be with them. You got to learn to reflect their emotions. Have good routines around goodbyes and hellos. Goodbyes and hellos for children can be rather challenging and chaotic moments for a child. Whatever you do, you can have a song, you can have a routine, you can have a little pinky handshake, and that you can then harness at the time of, that you can use at the time of hello and of goodbye to make those sort of soothing times. Make those reunions very present, right? It's easy to say, okay, hey, it's good to see you again. All right, let's get in the car. Be present at hello, be present at goodbye, but have that hello routine and that goodbye routine. Be aware of your own attachment style and attachment issues, as those are going to play a role in how you are present with your own child. For example, an anxiously attached parent may tend to be a little bit more hovery and not allow their child enough leeway to safely explore. Or an anxiously attached parent may portray the world to be a dangerous place to a child because of their own anxieties. Number 5, remember that it only takes one securely attached person in a child's life to help them feel securely attached. You may be concerned because you have a difficult or a narcissistic co-parent. It's okay. A child just needs one secure base. It's not obviously optimal for a child to have a negating parent, but in those early years, if you are able to be that for your child as their one good solid caregiver, you may be good. Your child will probably still grapple with anxiety from having a narcissistic parent, but you still could have given them that secure base. I'd love to hear, is there anything else you've done to try to avoid raising a narcissistic child, especially when you think about it in terms of attachment? Please leave a comment and let us know. As a child gets older, it does get a little harder to shift the course of attachment. A lot of this stuff gets set in early childhood, but always remember that brains are neuroplastic. They can change. And so I'm a believer that it is never too late to get good attachment practices into place as a parent. These attachment issues are a pillar of the origin of narcissism, and many of us can see how our own attachment styles very much impact us in adulthood. I mean, listen, would that we lived in a world of all full of securely attached people. It would be harmonious and kind and balanced and less violent. But here's the rub, gang. That is not the world that we live in. I hope all of this sheds some light on attachment and on narcissism. But I also want to make one other point. It's interesting. There's been some emails and comments like saying, I listen to these videos, but sometimes I'm worried, are you blaming the parents for their narcissistic children? No. The fact is, I have seen parents who have more than one child, 2, 3, 4 kids. One kid in the family is really narcissistic, and they have 3 really nice kids who are empathic and kind and compassionate. So the fact of the matter is, as you remember from other videos in this series, there's also that temperamental piece, that genetic part of personality. We're still learning about the genetics of narcissism. We're still learning about the origins of it. While obviously we want to give our kids the best leg up in terms of giving them healthy personalities, but I myself have worked with families where there have been 2 absolutely devoted, available, present parents, where the child, by all best reports, had a secure attachment. And then I'm working with the family, and they have adult children who are ragingly narcissistic, and they did a good job as parents. So please know that this is not meant to say, oh, that reason my kid's narcissistic is I was not a secure caregiver. You may very well have been. There may have been other disruptions. You may have had a malignant narcissistic spouse or a difficult narcissistic spouse, which also made it harder. Temperament may have played a role. So please understand, in more cases than not, every kid in the family is not narcissistic. It's one, and there are others that are healthy. We still are trying to figure out there are no absolutes when it comes to human development. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe. Thank you for joining this community. You're being a part of it, and you sharing it and liking it ensures that this content gets to more people, so more and more folks understand narcissistic abuse. Thanks again. Abuse. Thanks again. Abuse. Thanks again.